So it's my pleasure to invite Professor Martin Murray of the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, as well as Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, to be the moderator of the third and final panel. So he's not going to be able to be with us till the end, but when he steps out to go teach, I am going to step in to help him conclude the moderation of that panel. And for panelists, please look in that direction. There is going to be someone showing you how much time you have left when you are speaking. And yes, please, yes, Martin, over to you. Yes. Or do you want me to call everyone? Huh? Do you want, okay. Yeah, so you don't have to introduce.
Introduce them all.
No, just name them because
Okay.
they already have the details.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. We're going to start this next panel right away. I'm Martin Murray in Taubman and in DAS. I think this topic is an incredibly important one: prolonged conflict and regional implications. It really, and this whole program is extremely timely, and I'm really glad that University of Michigan is putting it out front as a topic of conversation. I'm going to introduce the panelists by name, and then they'll come to their seats. Timothy Berke from Taubman College, Laura Beny, Professor of Law, Chris Tounsel from University of Washington, and finally Husam Mahjoub, a co-founder of Sudan Bukra.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. It's an honor to be a part of this panel and such a timely discussion of the conflict in Sudan. My name's Tim Berke. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at Taubman College of Urban Planning here at University of Michigan. And I'm going to specifically talk about the impacts of the conflict in Sudan on South Sudan. So just a bit of background about why I'm up here and talking. I lived and worked in South Sudan for 8 years prior to starting my PhD here. I was in various capacities in that sense. I did a lot of research for humanitarian agencies as well as government agencies. I worked for the National Peace and Reconciliation Committee for 2.5 years, and many other hats, and I'm a happy resident of South Sudan. My dissertation specifically focuses on urban displacement, displaced populations, whether they're IDPs or refugees, and alternatives to refugee camps or IDP camps. And for my dissertation, I've specifically focused on IDPs in South Sudan and refugees, South Sudanese refugees in northern Uganda. I use kind of a mixed methods approach. So I won't be talking about my research here, but afterwards I'm happy to talk a lot about my research. This is more of just a general overview. Okay. So Sudan and South Sudan are quite intertwined, as a lot of people have suggested over the past few presentations and panels. We know through the protracted war for 40 years that it was very much framed as a North-South war, but it was very left out the North-North conflicts and the South-South conflicts. The North-North being kind of expressed now, and the South-South expressed over the past decade in 2013 and 2016 in South Sudan. Now, after the comprehensive peace agreement, there are still a lot of ties. You know, oil sharing revenue being one of the biggest, where they're economically very tied to each other, Sudan and South Sudan, with the majority of the oil reserves in South Sudan, but the pipeline going north to Port Sudan. Even the airspace, 2 years ago when conflict erupted in Sudan, I was in Juba and the airport actually closed even though there was no conflict because the airspace was technically still in one shared intertwined. And of course, border demarcation, in the case of Abyei Administrative Area, it's still kind of been left behind, but there's still a lot of intertwined challenges between Sudan and South Sudan. And really going back to the oil revenue sharing, you know, that's 90% of South Sudan's GDP, so it really does affect Sudan. When Sudan's impacted, it definitely affects South Sudan. So just to get a few numbers, we've talked about this in the past throughout the day, but 11.5 million people have been displaced totally, and the largest group of that are internally displaced persons, so they have not left Sudan. They're still within the borders there, but they have left fled their homes. And I think it's important to note that this is the largest child displacement, and 90% of the schools are no longer functioning, so kids are no longer being educated. Then there's refugees, 3 million refugees. So this is people that have fled the country and seeking asylum in neighboring countries, such as Chad and Egypt, and 500,000 have gone into South Sudan, specifically on the border regions there, and in urban areas such as Juba or state capitals. And then there's a third group. So Sudan was hosting over 1 million refugees, which was the second largest in the continent. And a majority of those were South Sudanese from the conflict this past decade. And while these influx of displaced persons are now returnees into South Sudan, it's causing a lot of challenges with limited resources at either city levels or in the rural areas along the border. So before talking about the challenges, I think there's opportunities amidst some of these challenges, specifically for South Sudan. While there's been kind of a brain drain of displacement for professionals in Sudan, a lot have been relocating in Juba and other areas. So for example, doctors. I was in Juba a couple months ago, and now there's almost the capacity of doctors in South Sudan is almost doubled, as well as professors. The university is now overfilled with professors where they were struggling before to meet some capacity. Again, Professor Jok said, this transfer of human capital, though born from a crisis, provides an unexpected opportunity for South Sudan to strengthen its fragile public institutions. Another kind of progressive thing that South Sudan has at a policy level, they're struggling to implement a bit here, is this idea of freedom of movement for refugees, which isn't the same case in most countries, where people can contribute to the economy of South Sudan, as well as negotiation with chiefs on the border for providing land for self-sufficiency and agricultural uses. And of course, shared cultural and sporting events, whether it's food, music, or I took a photo here. Top photo is Sudan's playing, the national team playing soccer a few months ago in South Sudan's stadium there. And then this, the photo beneath is a Darfurian woman that found a space in Gumbo Market just north of Juba, contributing to Juba's economy there. That said, of course, the focus is on the burdens and risk to the conflict in Sudan for South Sudan is the topic I'm talking about here. And I think most of you know that the oil infrastructure has been damaged throughout the war just south of Khartoum. And 70% of the oil revenue that comes from South Sudan has no longer been pumping for the past year. Again, indicating 90% of the GDP for South Sudan is through oil revenue. This has also cut trade routes for food coming into South Sudan and has significantly impacted food prices and other inflation challenges that have been happening. And though it's not the only reason, civil servants now in South Sudan have not been paid in 12 months. This is teachers, policemen, doctors, whatever it may be. All civil servants have not been paid in 12 months, causing some kind of tensions within the country in itself. Additionally, on kind of like the rural border areas, there's limited resources already there with such a large influx of populations, both South Sudanese returning and Sudanese refugees. It's causing some over some tensions over limited resources there. But I do think if direct humanitarian engagement is provided there, it can mitigate some of these by providing new services, whether it's schools, health clinics, water pumps, that as peace comes and Sudanese are able to return will be lasting kind of monuments of solidarity, but also infrastructure in the south. And then regional instability. Again, bringing up the Abyei area, Abyei administrative area, there have been armed groups both from South Sudan and Sudan in an area that has been demilitarized through a ceasefire, causing some tensions of intercommunal clashes there. But my main point is here that these tensions are growing, and it's a problem that people have kind of left behind. Abyei in general, I think the people there have felt unprioritized over the past few decades of not being able to go for a referendum. So some just basic overarching recommendations. I might take back the first one of supporting the AU in negotiations after today. I've learned a lot. But in general, just supporting kind of these multilateral negotiations, whatever that may look like. I'll have some questions with some of you as well. I think prioritizing the Abyei referendum to let people decide. I know that's very complicated now with instability, but I think at least having these negotiations and on the table is important to do. One of the highest needs, I think, is supporting humanitarian needs. It's very underfunded right now, under-resourced, which a lot of people have mentioned. And to kind of get specific about it and bring in some of my research at the end here, when looking at providing aid, in this case I'll say education, because I mentioned education is a big challenge for Sudanese children that are now coming into South Sudan. It needs to go beyond just bilateral agreements with UNICEF and the Ministry of Education. It needs to go down to the local level and build capacity at the Ministry of Education in Maban County, in Rang County, specifically, because if things go well and there's more schools built, Sudanese teachers are being employed to work in these humanitarian agencies, or whatever that may look like. The ministry at the county level will need to have capacity if hundreds of thousands of people are now being added to those school areas. And that kind of goes across any kind of sector of adding enhanced capacity at the local level, which also is overlooked. So that's all I'll say for now, but I'm happy to answer questions and discuss more.
Excuse me, do you have a website? Okay. Well, I'll get started. Hello, thank you for inviting me, African Studies Center. I'm very glad, honored to talk about Sudan and South Sudan here today. I am actually, my name is Laura Nyantung Ben. The Y is silent. You didn't know that, that's fine. So just a little bit of personal background. I am a law professor at the University of Michigan Law School. I've taught here since 2003. I teach courses in economics, law and economics, business law, corporate finance, and more recently, law and development, and a course in Africa called Africa in the Global Legal System, which I recently developed, and really love teaching because it brings all my interests together in one spot. At any rate, I did not prepare PowerPoint or any essay, so I'm speaking off the cuff here. But I would like to start by just saying, my father was from South Sudan. He came to the United States in the mid-1960s. He came to Indiana. He grew up, he was actually the only child in his family of 7 children who went to school. He's also the only person in his family that left the country, left actually the village. So he was the only one to learn to read and write, and he met my mother here in Indiana, and you can imagine the racial tensions in the 60s. They had to look for somebody to marry them. Sadly, it was not his first exposure to racism. He experienced racism in the Sudan. Oh, thank you. Thanks. He did exceptionally well in school, so he went to Khartoum in the late 1950s to go to the University of Khartoum after he finished at Rumbek Secondary School. And there he came together with people from all over the Sudan, Northerners, Westerners, and just a very small handful of South Sudanese. But racism was a real thing, and it was before the NIF, before the National Islamic Front, before the National Congress Party of Bashir. So just to push back a little bit and say that it is not just the case that NCP, Bashir, propagandized the country. Racism is deeply embedded in the Sudanese society, and the sooner that is dealt with, uncovered, and excavated and dealt with, I think the sooner the country will heal, whether united with North and South or not, because obviously with the departure of South Sudan, Sudan still has the problems. It used to be called the problem of South Sudan, but the country is imploding. And one of my contentions here today is that we're dealing with a decolonization of sorts, in the sense that if you look at Darfur, Darfur was not even part of the Sudan. Well, Sudan did not exist until the borders were created by the colonists. Darfur was an independent sultanate. It was an independent state for hundreds of years before the early 20th century. So to some extent, to a large extent, I argue that what we're seeing now is the implosion of the colonial boundaries. Whether that's good or bad, that's something that Sudanese should discuss. But the fact remains that South Sudan has already departed from that situation. So let me just say that, again, by way of I'm sorry, I'm going long with my introduction, but I heard a lot that kind of provoked me. It is the case that the war in Sudan, people did know in Sudan what was happening in the war. Here in the 90s and the early 2000s. I was often shouted out of fora because I talked about the slavery that was occurring in Sudan. I was shouted out because I was one voice, and the reality of the development, Amani mentioned it, Amani Al-Jaq mentioned the fact that very few Southern Sudanese had opportunities, educational, to come abroad. So I was often the only South Sudanese in a room where the discussion of the Civil War was taking place, and I was often shouted out of there by talking about the slavery and the racism. So now that takes me, going to the geopolitical ramifications of the war. So I drew this from, I think this is it the Council on Foreign Relations? Okay. So this map is from the Council on Foreign Relations, and it shows you visually, this is the only slide I have prepared. I didn't even prepare it. I drew it from somewhere else. But it shows that it says Sudan has become a proxy war for outside powers. And the green shows the countries that support the Sudanese army, the SAF. I'm sure you heard all day about SAF versus RSF. So Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, they are supporting the Sudanese army. And then we have schizophrenia, if you will. Russia is both green and orange. It's supporting, it has flip-flopped. The Wagner group from Russia, the quasi-private mercenary, has supported the RSF, but the Russian government has supported SAF. I'm not clear today as of, where it stands as of today, but I would say that Russia has been on both sides of the matter. And then we have the United Arab Emirates, very small country, but playing a very outsized role in the conflict in the Sudan. I think Nasreen has already talked about the UAE and the Gulf states' political economic interests in the Sudan, the minerals, the oil, gold, agriculture. They don't have their own agricultural production. They import virtually all, if not all, of their food. And so Sudan is very critical in that point. Looking at the map, you see that Sudan, it straddles North Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, as well as, am I leaving anything out? That's pretty much it, but it straddles multiple geopolitical dimensions. So there are many parties that are interested, and what I've shown here, which I drew again from the CFR, is just a small piece of it. Other countries that are involved include China, France indirectly because its weapons make their way through the United Arab Emirates to Sudan. Serbia has been implicated. Ukraine has been implicated. Ukraine has soldiers on the ground, mainly to psychologically terrorize the Russians. And then you have Azerbaijan. I'm not clear what their role is in that situation. Then Egypt is involved. Well, I've already pointed that. Turkey is involved. Turkey supposedly supports the RSF. So what is the implication? Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Israel, these are other interested parties. So what is the implication? Why am I pointing this out? I'm pointing it out because, thank you, basically any solution must involve the parties that have political economic interests in the Sudan. Any piecemeal approach that just brings Burhan and Hamedi together will not address the problem. Because the powerful political actors, particularly in the Middle East, they will still have their investments, as Reed talked about this extensively, their wonderful presentation. They will still have their interests in the Sudan. And so any kind of agreement, handshake between these two warring parties will be temporary. What role does the United States play in this? Well, we've just had an election, as you all know. For better or for worse. I would say for better, because it's democracy. However, the question is, what will the role of the Trump administration be toward the Sudan? Trump, pretty much, he's transactional. He does not have much faith or even much use for multilateral institutions. And so he prefers diplomacy, bilateral diplomacy. So what leverage can he use, or as Americans, can Americans use to bring peace to Sudan, or at least assist in that effort? Trump can use the American good relations with the UAE and with Saudi Arabia to possibly bring peace. Maybe they can flatter him and give him the illusion that he is achieving peace. He likes to be flattered. He's a narcissist. He likes to be seen as the good person. So to the extent that they can foster a settlement and give Trump the illusion that he has brought that about, maybe that we can cultivate that to bring peace in the region. What about China? Well, China has extensive economic interests in the Sudan as well as in South Sudan, the oil in particular, but not just oil, other sectors of the economy. China is interested in a rapid resolution of the conflict because, without peace, its investments are significantly at significant risk. Actually, speaking of that, the United Nations has not been as proactive as it could have been toward the conflict in the Sudan. The United Nations, basically, in my opinion, is hindered by the conflicts in Gaza as well as conflict in the Ukraine. The Security Council also, because the United States and Russia have veto power, it's very hard to get resolutions passed at the United Nations Security Council. In fact, today, there was a deliberations at the Security Council. I don't know if you've seen the news, but I checked it on my way in. Russia vetoed a resolution that was put on the table before the Security Council today that called for immediate cessation of hostilities as well as unhindered delivery of aid to the Sudan. Russia vetoed that. So at the Security Council level, I don't hold out much hope because you have, on the one hand, you have the United States and the Western powers at the Security Council, and on the other hand, you have Russia. And they're typically going to vote in opposite directions. And as long as one of them vetoes, then there's deadlock and nothing can get done. So that's what happened today, unfortunately. As you've heard today, that this is one of the largest, actually the largest currently humanitarian disaster in the world. Thank you. African Union has not been playing a role. Sudan needs a peacekeeping force. There needs to be an international peacekeeping force to protect the civilians. There needs to be an arms embargo. Right now there's an arms embargo, but it only applies to Darfur. It does not apply to the entirety of the Sudan. And so weapons, and even the one in Darfur is still not enforced. It's not strongly enforced, so weapons are still coming in. Both parties, just in the recent news, both parties have imported new arms. There are drones, there are, I don't know the terminology, I hate military terminology, but whatever, drones and et cetera, have come into the country. And the conflict is at this point just going to get worse. That takes me to South Sudan. First presenter actually did a nice job of talking about South Sudan's interests in the war, in the conflict. Obviously, it's potentially destabilizing for South Sudan because, well, first of all, the economic destabilization, 90% of the revenues. So if those revenues are cut off through war destruction, then South Sudan does not earn its revenues, can't pay its civil servants, et cetera. And I know all about that because my father was a professor at the University of Juba and during the Civil War, the Second Civil War, and there were months and months and months where they did not get paid. I think South Sudan, this is not talked a lot about in the larger geopolitical framework, but I think South Sudan, maybe I'm just being naive and wishful thinking, but I think South Sudan potentially can play a role in bringing peace to Sudan, even though it has its own problems. Out of all the players that I've just mentioned, South Sudan is the party that is more intimately familiar with Sudanese and with the Sudanese state. So I think that's something worth exploring. To what extent can South Sudan help to bring peace to the Sudan, and in particular at the people-to-people level that you mentioned, Sarah. I think there's hope there because one of John Garang's visions for Sudan was a new Sudan founded on peace through development and people-to-people peace. And that's something that I think is not sufficiently explored when we're looking at these, larger geopolitical frameworks. And that would be the irony of all ironies that, South Sudan plays a pivotal role in bringing peace to the Sudan. The New Sudan vision obviously failed and South Sudan seceded. However, maybe this is, something that can be redeemed. So with that, I will stop here. I think I'm out of time.
Good afternoon. Yes, thank you so much. So I'm going to be following up both Timothy and Laura on what they have shared in terms of South Sudan. Hopefully, I will bring a bit of a different perspective, which I believe I will, so we'll see. On July 9th, 2011, a prophecy 2,500 years in the making was realized. That is, according to millions of South Sudanese Christians. After decades of civil war, northern and southern Sudan were officially torn asunder when voters decided in a referendum in January of that year to create the world's newest country, the Republic of South Sudan. Many interpreted this moment as the realization of a prophecy from Isaiah chapter 18, where, a group of Cushites are described as blowing a trumpet horn and bringing glory to God. The initial draft of South Sudan's national anthem referred to the country as a land of milk and honey, and President Salva Kiir was likened to biblical Joshua, who led the emancipated Israelites through the wilderness into their Canaanite promised land. But South Sudanese independence has been far from a storybook ending. Conversely, it has been a tragedy, some would argue, of biblical proportion, right? Ethnic factionalism persisted and erupted into civil war in December of 2013, right? Between groups loyal to Riek Machar and President Kiir. And while both men agreed to a peace agreement in 2018, nearly 7 years later, its citizens face state limits to their freedom of expression, arbitrary arrests and detention, sexual-based violence, and extrajudicial executions. Now, for the past year and a half, obviously its neighbor to the north has had its own share of troubles, right? An estimated 62,000 killed, more than 8 million displaced, 25 million in need of humanitarian assistance, and Sudan now dons the unenviable mantle of being the hungriest country on earth. But while the country is obviously the one that stands to be most impacted by prolonged conflict, the war also holds major ramifications for the nation with which it shares its longest international border, which is South Sudan. And so for the brief moment of time that I have with you, I'll discuss 3 areas that the war has impacted the country, as well as implications that prolonged war could have on what is the world's youngest nation. So first and foremost, I think we can all agree that the most important impact is the impact on the people, right? South Sudan has an estimated population of 12.7 million, with capital Juba housing a little under 500,000. However, a significant proportion of the population is in exile. The South Sudanese civil war displaced millions, and many refugees have continued to be driven by hunger, disease, economic hardship, and armed conflict, which has actually increased since 2020 due to power-sharing tensions. And this has caused the country's worst food crisis since independence. And when violence broke out up north in Khartoum last April, nearly 800,000 South Sudanese refugees were still living within Sudan. As of this past July, the UN reported that 2.2 million South Sudanese remained internally displaced within Sudan, right? Or I'm sorry, within South Sudan, right? And now added to the forced dispersal of South Sudanese away from their country, last month the UN reported that more than 500,000 Sudanese refugees have fled into South Sudan. South Sudan now ranks as the largest recipient of people fleeing Sudan, right behind Chad, with 810,000 new arrivals since last April, right? And so this influx of people obviously presents challenges for incorporating into local economies and communities, right? And then there's the economy, right? So in addition to the war's demographic and social impacts on Sudan, there is South Sudan's economy, which even before last April was at a tipping point, right? The country has suffered severe droughts and flooding since independence, and that has led to the loss of livestock. Between June 22 and June of 23, the cost of fuel increased by more than 79%, and the price of food more than doubled, right? The prices of essential goods have skyrocketed, which has limited resources for host communities and created barriers for new arrivals. And so each of these elements of the economy would have already been cause for major concern in the absence of a major civil war with the nation with which it shares its longest geographic border, right? But obviously that has happened, right? And this conflict has negatively impacted the single most important bedrock of South Sudan's economy, which is, of course, the flow of oil, right? South Sudan, proverbially speaking, sits on an ocean of oil. South Sudan contains sub-Saharan Africa's third largest oil reserves behind Angola and Nigeria. And as Timothy mentioned, right, oil constituted more than 90% of the country's revenues last year. But obviously, because of South Sudan's landlocked status, Sudan is the only route to export oil to international markets. Thank you. Namely through two pipelines to Port Sudan, right? The conflict has disrupted supply routes and oil exports, with one of the major pipelines responsible for 2/3 of South Sudanese oil exports breaking down in February. Now, while the Sudanese government recently announced that repairs to the pipeline were complete and that oil exports could resume, the disruption in the flow of oil had already led to inflation and exerted more pressure on what was already a weak economy. And so, obviously, prolonged conflict and increased endangerment of the pipeline would only spell more disaster for South Sudan. And then, last but not least, there is South Sudanese President Salva Kiir. And I would love to kind of talk with Laura about this because I kind of have a different perspective on what the possibility of South Sudan participating in the peace talks could mean, but yeah. So Salva Kiir was elected of what was then Southern Sudan in 2010, right? Obviously, the Stetson that he wears, many of you in this room know that was given to him by President George W. Bush, right? But South Sudan has not held national elections since becoming independent in 2011. Elections that were slated to have been held in 2015, 2018, 2021, 2023, and 2024 have all been postponed, right? The elections have now been postponed to December of 2026, right? The government claims that it needs more time to complete a census, register political parties, and draft a permanent constitution. And through it all, Salva Kiir has presided over a government that has been accused of a plethora of human rights abuses, not limited to, but including the detention of political prisoners, unlawful killings, harassment and torture, denial of fair public trial, conflict-related abuses, including the use of child soldiers, and violations to freedom of expression. Against this obviously less than stellar backdrop of governance, he has assumed the role of peacemaker in the current Sudanese civil war. Last April, he led the Intergovernmental Authority on Development's mediation team and shared his efforts to engage with Hemeti and Burhan. He later persuaded the SPLM North to refrain from attacking the Sudanese army. And 4 months ago, he met with Hemeti to discuss concerns about oil security. Now, I believe that continued conflict in Sudan could actually further entrench Salva Kiir's position within South Sudan's presidency, which, in my personal opinion, would be lamentable, but he could use the war's destabilizing impact on South Sudan's populace and economy to further postpone elections. He could also use continued crisis on his border and refugee influxes into South Sudan to further justify autocratic, undemocratic policies in the name of maintaining, quote, law and order, end quote, within his own national borders. He could leverage his position as a peacemaker in Sudan to persuade his own nation that he is the right person to lead the country and its future relationship with a post-war Sudan. As Burhan and Hemeti fight for control in Sudan, the war could actually solidify Salva Kiir's control over his own. So in conclusion, right, I think it's imperative to state and restate the obvious, right? Sudan is in the eye of the storm, right? Sudanese are being preeminently and overwhelmingly impacted by the conflict. And media outlets throughout the world have failed, criminally so, in their duty to direct attention towards Sudan. But in the midst of it all, the conflict may stand to have no greater impact on any other country on earth than Sudan's neighbor to the south. Thank you for your time.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for organizing this symposium, and thank you for having me. First, I would like to acknowledge that this gathering of ours would not have been possible nor filled with determination and hope without the bravery of our martyrs and revolutionaries. These sacrifices will remain immortal in the conscience of our noble people. Today I'm here to present and discuss a critical yet often unspoken factor fueling the ongoing war in Sudan, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, and its deep-rooted influence in sustaining the war. By examining the UAE's active role in the conflict and its regional agenda, we can understand why addressing this influence is essential for stopping the war and achieving peace in Sudan. And I'd like to start by sharing that I spent 12 years of my life, my entire school years, in the Sultanate of Oman, near the border with the UAE. Additionally, I lived a total of 15 years in the UAE, including studying, doing my undergrad in its main and oldest university, UAE University. This background has given me a hands-on, in-depth understanding of the region. The UAE is the foreign player most invested in this war. Its role in Sudan's war is deliberate, systematic, and spans across financial, military, logistical, political, and PR support for the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. As the RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, continue to battle for control, the UAE's direct and comprehensive support has been crucial for the RSF's ability to fight and grow in power. Emirati support has enabled RSF leader Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Hemeti to strengthen his militia and turn it into a powerful actor within Sudan and the region. Thank you. Sudan, so what is the UAE's involvement in the conflict or in the war? Sudan is key to the UAE's strategy in Africa and the Middle East, aimed at achieving political and economic hegemony while curbing democratic aspirations. Since 2015, the UAE has sourced fighters from both factions, RSF and SAF, to join to fight its war in Yemen. UAE is the primary importer of Sudan's gold, and has multi-billion-dollar plans to develop ports along Sudan's Red Sea coast, in addition to interest and investments in agricultural lands and livestock, basically land and water grabbing. By supporting the RSF and SAF leadership as well, the UAE has undermined the democratic transition that followed the 2019 ouster of Omar al-Bashir, Sudan's dictator for 30 years. From the early days of the war, the UAE established logistical operations to send weapons to the RSF through its massive networks in Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and Haftar, Libyan militia, and the Wagner, Russian militia. These arms transfers were disguised as humanitarian aid, helping the RSF maintain an uninterrupted supply chain despite international sanctions and embargoes to transfer arms to Darfur. In addition, RSF business, finance, logistics, and PR operations are carried out from the UAE. Injured fighters from the RSF have been airlifted to be treated in Abu Dhabi main military hospital. Late last year, Hemeti visited a few African countries on board an Emirati airplane belonging to a company owned by an Emirati member of the royal family of Abu Dhabi and an advisor to its president, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, better known as MBZ or MBZ. These interventions have been documented by credible reports from the UN panel of experts in Sudan, media outlets such as the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and CBS, and human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, among many others. One of the UAE's significant contributions to the war is through gold trade. Sudan is one of Africa's largest producers of gold, this has been said here many times, and much of this gold flows or is smuggled into the UAE through channels controlled by RSF-affiliated companies. Gold revenue provides the RSF with substantial funding, allowing it to procure arms, recruit personnel, including mercenaries from outside Sudan, from other African countries, and bolster its resources for the ongoing conflict. It's very important to highlight that gold continues to be smuggled or exported from the de facto government's areas to the UAE as of today via companies affiliated to the SAF, providing it with resources to continue functioning or fighting. Beyond physical support, the UAE has actively contributed to the RSF's public relations, reshaping Hemeti's image from a warlord into a regional leader. PR and lobbying firms and sophisticated media campaigns linked to the UAE, have been instrumental in crafting this image, promoting RSF as a legitimate political entity despite its record of human rights abuses. By fostering a favorable international view of the RSF, or attempting to, the UAE has ensured that this militia can operate with impunity, often skirting international criticism or sanctions that could hinder its operations. No sanctions have been enforced against Hemeti or his brother, Abdul Rahim. Recently, some sanctions were levied against their third brother, Al-Ghoni, who controls the finance network or business network in Dubai. And now, how the UAE's role fits its regional strategy? Because people ask this question. And what I claim is that the UAE's involvement in Sudan is not an isolated case, but it is a part of a broader strategy that seeks to expand its political influence and economic footprint across Africa and the Middle East. Over recent decades, the UAE has redefined its regional role, extending beyond the Gulf to emerge as a dominant economic and political power in Africa, leveraging its vast wealth to expand its reach. Africa has become central to the UAE's geopolitical strategy. Over the past decades, the UAE has invested close to $60 billion in Africa, making it the fourth largest foreign direct investor on the continent after China, the European Union, and the United States. In the last 2 years alone, the UAE has pledged $97 billion in new investments in Africa, which is 3 times more than China's commitment. Of course, the UAE's key areas of investment include ports, logistics and supply chains, mining, renewable energy, and agriculture. The UAE has positioned itself to dominate global trade routes by acquiring port concessions across Africa via companies like DP World and AD Ports Group, which both are owned by, DP World is owned by Dubai government, AD Ports Group is owned by Abu Dhabi government. Their port concessions can be found in places like Egypt and Algeria on the Mediterranean, Senegal, Guinea, Congo, DRC, and Angola on the Atlantic Ocean, Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya on the Indian Ocean, and in the Red Sea region, including the Horn of Africa, with projects in Somaliland, Puntland, and Egypt. Additionally, they have a contentious port in Djibouti, which is subject to a legal dispute with the Djibouti government. And they previously had a port in Eritrea that was used as a military base. A port deal also was signed in Sudan, $6 billion investment deal in Abu Amama, 200 kilometers north of Port Sudan, but this deal was recently scrapped by the de facto government of Sudan. In addition to the coastal ports, the UAE has invested in dry ports and container hubs in the African interior, with significant hubs located in Rwanda, South Africa, Tanzania, Morocco, and Nigeria. Additionally, the UAE acquired, or rather grabbed, land in several African countries for food production, agriculture, livestock, and carbon offset projects, frequently displacing local populations and causing environmental and social challenges. But beyond economic ambitions, the UAE has tied its investment to military influence. It has increasingly signed military cooperation agreements with countries where it has invested. These agreements often begin with military training and education initiatives and may later expand to include the export of UAE-manufactured arms. In some countries, the UAE has deployed soldiers and provided military equipment for active combat operations, such as those targeting militant Islamist groups in the Sahel region and in Somalia, as well as its participation in the NATO intervention in Libya. Additionally, the UAE has supplied drones to the Ethiopian government, playing a critical role in shifting the balance of power in favor of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed during the conflict with the Tigray forces. It has also established bases in Eritrea, Somalia, including Puntland and Somaliland, Yemen, Libya, and Chad, supporting factions like Sudan's RSF and Haftar militia, often implicated in human rights abuses. In mining, the UAE focuses on strategic minerals and is a hub for African gold, illicit African gold, though it faces, of course, allegations of gold smuggling and money laundering. These investments serve dual purposes: resource extraction and geopolitical influence. Internationally, the UAE has, diversified its alliances, establishing strong economic ties with China and Russia, while maintaining strong Western relationships through military, trade, and investment relationships, in addition to strategic lobbying efforts. This lobbying, along with extensive media, entertainment, and sports sponsorship, aims to portray the UAE as a modern, progressive nation, making controversial foreign policy practices. And now to the last part of my presentation, what must be done? In my view, to pave a path toward peace in Sudan, however difficult, the international community must address the UAE's direct role in sustaining the RSF and undermining Sudan's political stability. There are specific steps that need to be taken. One, accountability through international pressure. Western governments, particularly the US and the UK, must go beyond closed-door diplomacy and publicly hold the UAE accountable for its interference in Sudan. Instead of prioritizing diplomatic ties, these countries should call out the UAE's activities in Sudan for what they are: a systematic destabilization that threatens peace in the entire region. Two, global advocacy and media exposure. The UAE is sensitive to its international image, portraying itself as progressive and neutral player in the Middle East. Publicizing its extensive involvement in Sudan's war will challenge this narrative, making it harder for the UAE to continue supporting the RSF covertly. Civil society organizations, activists, celebrities, and media personnel play a crucial role in exposing this, ensuring that the UAE's role in Sudan is widely known and criticized on global platforms. The third point is economic sanctions and targeted measures. By targeting UAE-linked companies that finance RSF operations, such as gold trading firms, the international community can reduce the RSF's financial lifelines. Sanctioning these networks and entities directly involved in Sudan's destabilization, including European arm manufacturers like the French company that Laura just mentioned, could weaken the RSF, pressuring them to take real steps towards a ceasefire. And lastly, empowering Sudanese voices. Sudan's future should be determined by the Sudanese people, free from foreign influence. Amplifying the voices of Sudanese activists, citizens, and leaders who advocate for peace and democracy is essential. By supporting Sudanese-led peace initiatives and discouraging external meddling, including insisting on repeating the failed attempts of liberal peace-making processes, the international community can foster an environment where Sudan's citizens can shape their own destiny. In conclusion, Sudan's conflict will not end until the UAE's role is acknowledged and confronted directly. This issue transcends Sudan's borders, challenging global values of sovereignty, peace, and justice. By addressing the UAE's actions, we stand with the Sudanese people's right to self-determination, peace, and against foreign interventions that prolong suffering and chaos. Thank you.
First, I think we should thank the panelists for giving really provocative presentations. I think the first order of business would be if any of the panelists had any questions or comments to make about each other's presentations first, and then we'll open it to the audience. If you have comments, try to keep them to a minimum, and we'll go, there's microphones on both sides that will move around that way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, it's true about the UAE. I heard a story last year about how they have displaced the Maasai in Tanzania, and those people have no recourse whatsoever. It kind of reminds me of a story that my father told me when he was at the opening of the Nyakoran Cultural Center in Juba in the 1970s, I think. Ali Mazrui came to town and gave a presentation there. He was a complicated figure, but he said, 50 years from now, you will all be Arabs and speaking Arabic. It sounded sort of ridiculous at the time, but in light of the situation, there was a great deal of truth in it.
I'll just make a, can you hear me? Hello? Just a small comment to kind of link, I think, yeah. Hello? Yeah, just a small comment to kind of link a few discussions talking about South Sudan playing a role in the peace process. They have a lot of experience in negotiating. But I also think UAE has a big influence in that as well. As over the past year, Salva Kiir and other political leaders in South Sudan have had very direct meetings in UAE, and I think there's a lot of push for them to also support some kind of peace negotiations in one way or another, or a resolution. So I'm just trying to link a few words together. I think there's some synergy there.
Yeah, and if I may add, actually, this reminded me of a recent, like a few months ago, a very weird deal, oil deal, that between a UAE company that is owned by a member of the Dubai royal family, Al Maktoum, basically, controlling the oil of South Sudan for the next, I don't know, 10 years or 15 years, something. Yeah, so this is how the UAE deals in Africa, covertly. So no one, actually, they are like, yeah, sponsoring celebrities and Manchester City and the Wimbledon, but this is what they are doing in Africa. So, yeah. And the, yeah.
With regard to the role of the United Arab Emirates, Husam, the other story which is less known is the total dependency of the Port Sudan de facto authority on the United Arab Emirates. All the financial transactions of the authorities in Port Sudan, which is the military council coming out of the October 2021 coup d'etat, are carried out through a government-owned bank which has a branch in Abu Dhabi, Al Nilain Bank. This is the only bank that is allowing them to transact internationally because of the financial isolation of Sudan. Sudan never came out of financial and banking relationships, even after the lifting of US sanctions, because there wasn't sufficient time under the civilian-led government to achieve this level of qualification, which requires a lot of, know your client and know your, and so on, a lot of transparency, anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism financing, and so on. The second thing is that most of Sudan exports go through the United Arab Emirates. So the gold that is officially exported, and the gold that is smuggled, and the gold that is exported without entering any books in the de facto authority institutions, all end up in Dubai, because this is where the traditional business relationships of Sudan have existed, and the role of private sector in the gold trade is very important, and they don't want to go to any other market, because in Dubai they can find financial facilities to buy these other consumer goods, including processed oil derivatives that are brought into Sudan and which are making whatever remains of Sudan functioning. So there is a financial lifeline of dependency from the authorities in Port Sudan on United Arab Emirates. And there are other aspects to it. I'm hearing credible reports yet to be verified, we are working on this, that all the imports of weapons that are purchased by either the Sudan Armed Forces or the Rapid Support Forces from international markets of weapons trade, black market trade, come through the free trade zones of United Arab Emirates. And United Arab Emirates, of course, is happy to see this happening because this is good for business. And it's playing this role in entire sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa with regard, for example, to conflict gold going to the United Arab Emirates. It's extensive. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. I have the statistics right here if you wanted me to pull it. If you look at it globally with regard to gold, conflict gold coming out of Uganda, Eastern Congo, Southern Sudan, Sudan coming out of Mali and all the Sahel countries and so on, it all ends up in Dubai. So the problem here is much larger than Dubai's support or the United Arab Emirates in support for the RSF. I would say it's this extraction to a level which is really contributing to massive institutional corruption across the continent, contributing to all these conflicts that are fed with the proceeds from smuggled primary resources, and on and on and on. So yeah, I'm just saying we are not out of the woods yet. I was looking, to have some positive note here, but it's always very difficult to find one.
Thank you. I have a question to Professor Laura. So why is the International Security Council not taking any measures against the UAE? And what are practical steps or measures that we can take as Sudanese, if there are any, to confront this evil?
I didn't hear okay, the first one is, why is the United Nations Security Council is deadlocked? And then the second one is, what can Sudanese do?
Yeah.
To
confront the UAE.
Oh, to confront the
Within
UAE.
that, I know that we have some countries backing us up, but they're not necessarily the most powerful.
Well, I mean, it's a general problem with the Security Council that because there are 5 countries with a veto, which is completely just a fluke of history. It's the victors of World War II, the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France. They have the veto, and then there are 10 non-permanent members. But to get any resolution passed, any decision-making, you cannot have a veto of one of the 5 permanent members. And usually Russia and the United States are on opposite sides. And so today, the resolution that they deliberated upon today to basically stop hostilities and allow unfettered aid, Russia actually vetoed it this time. Probably because Britain was the author of the resolution. A lot of it is just political jockeying that has nothing to do with the situation in the country that is concerned, in this case, Sudan. I mean, arguably, it would be in the whole entire global interest for peace to come to Sudan, but they're always in opposition, these geopolitical forces. So that's the first question. Structurally, I don't hold out much hope that solutions will come at that level, that high level, which actually relates to your second question. I think Sudanese, so to be honest with you, I sort of detached from Sudan after South Sudan seceded, because I was a Sudanese citizen too, but I lost my citizenship and became South Sudanese. And I just kind of was not following very closely for a while. But when the war broke out in 2023, I tried to follow Sudanese online. And I think one thing that the international community finds it hard to understand is what is actually the situation, what's going on, what is the cause of the conflict. See, with the North and South, it was pretty obvious. I mean, obviously highly simplified in many cases, race, religion, resources. But with Sudan, everyone is Muslim for the most part. You don't have a Christian minority. There are a small group of Coptics, maybe a few Jewish still there, Greeks. But so it's very hard for an outsider to understand what the stakes are internally with the Sudanese, the civilians. It's just, I don't think there's a unified voice. Sometimes I hear people supporting the SAF. Sometimes I hear people supporting the RSF. I don't see a national vision other than some generalities. And maybe I'm simplifying because I don't have deep connections there now. I don't hear a unified voice about the vision of the Sudan other than we want democracy and we want civilian rule. But what does that mean? Because Sudan has had democracy and civilian rule before. And like I said earlier, even under democracy, there was a resurgence of slavery in the South during the Civil War under Sadiq and the Umma Party in the 1980s. And the RSF is a creation of the war that was perpetrated against South Sudan. So, I mean, I don't want to be rude, but it's almost like the chickens come home to roost. And so I think globally you need a unified voice. You need a very clear-cut program of your vision. You know, with the war in South, we had New Sudan vision, a vision of New Sudan, which was rejected overwhelmingly in the North, but a unified vision. And then go and protest in the UAE too. Just kidding.
Oh, okay. Do you want to respond to that, Chris?
Yes, please. To follow up on that, and thank you so much, because I think that one of the kind of tragedies of international attention towards the Sudan conflict has been what I believe has been among the African American community of which I am a part, highly imbalanced attention towards Gaza at the expense, in my personal opinion, of the Sudan. And I think a part of that imbalanced attention is because what is happening in Sudan is very, it's not being communicated and broken down on kind of popular media platforms in ways that are easily accessible and understandable. Within the African American community, there was a lot of participation within the Save Darfur movement, right? Which was still problematic because, of course, this was in the wake of the war on terror. And so there was a lot of demonization of Arabs and Muslims going on in the early 2000s, of which, just being completely real, some major black celebrities were a part of, right? But 20 years later, right, I think that, well, no, not I think, I know, objectively speaking, that Sudan is not appearing in African American media platforms nearly to the extent that Sudan was very much circulating among black people in this country. So I think that one of the tragedies of the current situation from a media perspective is the fact that, you know, one crisis, very understandably so, is receiving a lot of attention, but one in the Sudan is not.
Yeah, if you allow me, I want to. Yeah, I want to comment also first on Dr. Suleiman. Well, what you said about the UAE's support to SAF is true. Actually, not only Al-Nilain Bank, but Bank of Khartoum, which is now the main channel with which the Sudanese diaspora transfer money to our relatives back home. This is the majority shareholders are Emirati banks, and but the UAE has always played, for the past 2 or 3 decades, has always played this role of a haven to evade economic sanctions, and having these relationships with both parties. So at the peak of its animosity with Iran, Dubai was the main place where to evade the sanctions, the economic sanctions against Iran, with Iranian businessmen and exports and imports going through Dubai, while Abu Dhabi, the capital, has cut the diplomatic relations with Iran, and it is doing this today with Russia. At the peak of the international economic sanctions against Russia, the Russian oligarchs are filling Dubai's malls and fancy malls, and so this has been a role that the UAE has played, and throughout the more than 2 decades of cold diplomatic relationships with the Umar al-Bashir's regime. Umar al-Bashir and his family and the companies that are affiliated with the Sudanese armed forces and the security apparatus in the UAE had presence in Sudan, had presence in the UAE, and as you said, this has continued. The UAE has been the main channel with which the Sudan was importing and exporting, and this has continued. I want to, just to comment also on why, so one of the reasons why I think the African American attention to the Sudanese thing, it's media, but again, I think that the UAE and us, and we the Sudanese political forces have played a role in this. Because despite the fact that not all Palestinians are Hamas, but they were very clear from day one that this war was against Palestine. It wasn't against Hamas. All the Palestinian people saw this aggression as against Palestine. This is true for Lebanon. Despite the fact that most of the Lebanese are not Hezbollah, they were also from day one, most of them were clear that this aggression was against Lebanon. So that was the narrative. The Sudanese political forces also helped and aided by by millions of dollars worth of money that go to PR and strategic consultants, help playing the role of what about? You talk about the RSF committing a genocide in Geneina. What about the SAF bombing, continuing aerial bombardment? You can say both, but you can say that this is a genocide in Geneina. You talk about UAE is supporting the RSF. What about Egypt? Egypt is supporting and Iran is supporting. So we failed as Sudanese, and I think the UAE has played a role here in not being able to say, well, to agree on the level of the atrocities happening in Sudan.
All right, thank you. More questions, please.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I had questions for everybody, but I know other people want to ask questions. So, Chris, I've been doing work with African Americans since the early 2000s, and I think that Ustaz Husam is absolutely right that Sudanese have not done enough. But you just articulated also another issue within the African American community, of which I am one and have been for decades, and that is that there is not, not all African Americans are persuaded that Sudanese are African. It's just as simple as that. And I think that that is partly the responsibility, of course, of Sudanese elites, but as an African American community, it's also our responsibility to understand this is an African country in every shape or form. It is a country that really is kind of the paradigmatic African country from the ancient civilizations of which we give lectures about, and where my family's from, for example. So that there is also on the other side of the equation a really interesting kind of necessity to really educate ourselves. And every time I appear on a local African American radio, the response is amazing, extraordinary. Welcoming in a way that is not present in other radio stations. The interest is there, I would argue, equally, if not more, than in Gaza, and I don't think one should be elevated above another. So I wanted to ask you what you think needs to be done, because we're talking about coalition building, looking to the future. And Husam, I have a question from you. I think both you and Suleiman have really intervened in a very interesting way, and you have persuaded us, I think, both of you together, that the story of the UAE is not about the UAE and RSF alone, right? I think that that is something many Sudanese will refuse to understand. And what is happening in the Sudanese community, of course, is that one party is seen to be in complete alliance, and it is, with the UAE, and the other somehow is now represented as innocent. And now we know that's not the case. It's extremely complicated. Complicated is not the right word. It's actually very clear. You just made it very clear. So the question that I have for you is, within the Sudanese community, the most interesting debate I find among Sudanese is when they say, well, the UAE wouldn't be able to do that if we did not allow it. And so I want you to go back to that side of the equation. Number one, what Sudanese need to know about this very interesting relationship on the part of both parties. I think that that is a campaign that should be one of your points, right? You can't say Sudanese civil society should act when they're not fully informed, I think, fully, right? And another thing is that may be more controversial, but I think it is important. In the language of peace agreements, there's usually this issue of a spoiler, right? Either local or international. In this case, the UAE is conceived, rightly so, as the spoiler to peace. So there are two kind of points of view. One, of course, is to dispel it completely, which I think would be preferable. But given how much you detailed all the intricate military, economic investments, geostrategic investments, and the fact that it's really has this larger plan throughout Africa and the Middle East, what do you think about what should be done in terms of peace agreements? Let's assume we're talking about peace negotiations. Should Geneva have occurred? Should the UAE have been invited or not? And looking towards the future, what is your opinion? Do we expel the UAE with all its wealth and power, or just turn away? Or do we actually see, because you've lived in the UAE and you can answer that for us, if it's a possibility, maybe it's not.
Okay, thank you. Hold your thoughts for a moment. Let's take maybe one or two more questions. All right, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My name is Saif Saeed from Uganda. I'm really happy to have people to be interested in Sudan and having this conference. Thank you guys very much. We understand that, to see what we are facing is really big. The fight within the Sudanese people, you see, for those who want the war to continue and those who want peace, is still, the fight is going on. And part of it, I mean, the feeling that the Muslim Brotherhood, and they are the one who want this war to continue because they want to have a solution after the war where they will come back and be in power in Sudan. And one of the causes of the war is that 21st of October or 25th of October, the coup which had happened at that time, and since then we are in a down spiral from there. And I'm not sure that whether what happened in Sudan was an accident. I don't think it's an accident. We could see the whole region in fire. I mean, everywhere you will see in Libya how the fight is going on until now, Syria. So the same thing is in Sudan, Chad, and all of those areas. So I don't know whether there is a will for peace in the regional power, because I think one of the reasons why we have this, when we get democracy and when we ask for democracy after the revolution, that had made really a shock down Egypt in particular, that they are not interested in seeing democracy in Sudan, which is their south border, the same thing for Saudi Arabia and UAE. So maybe Sudanese asking for democracy, that created, to see, kind of a spell on them, or a curse that, you see, they don't want this to happen. So that's why the whole region is trying, you see, to, I mean, kill this revolution. And this is a continuous effort. So I think those are very important issues that we have to discuss when we are discussing war in Sudan, is that how the regional power, I think all of them agree in not to have democracy in Sudan. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Could I give our panelists the opportunity to respond to all of those questions briefly?
Sure. Thank you so much for your comments about African-American media and the African-American community with respect to Sudan. I could literally talk for an hour on that. I will just give my shameless plug. I just wrote a book on African-Americans in Sudan that came out in June. So read the book and yes, but, and one of the major individuals that I talk about in the book is Ambassador Susan Page, because one of the reasons why I think it is so important for the African-American community to engage with the Sudan is, I mean, the first U.S. ambassador to South Sudan, an African-American woman from Chicago South suburbs. To me, that's a big deal, right? I think it's a big deal that Susan Rice was National Security Advisor, helping to implement, or ensure that the 2011 referendum went smoothly, right? I think it matters that when South Sudan became independent in July 2011, Barack Obama in his tweet mentions Dr. King in his tweet when talking about South Sudanese independence, right? And last but not least, in terms of what I think African Americans can do at this moment, as counterintuitive as it might be, I think it's to remain on X, i.e. Twitter. I know that there's been an exodus from X recently, and on one hand, I get it. I totally get it, given Musk, and I completely get it. However, Black Twitter for the last 15 years has been a cultural force and an information marketplace for Black Americans specifically. So I know that Nisreen recently tweeted about, the fact that a lot of people that she engages with throughout the diaspora are on X. And so there's a different kind of calculus that, comes up when it's, when one talks about boycotting X, when you're like, well, this is actually a vital information lifeline, right? So yeah.
Thank you. Professor Khalid, well, I'll try to be brief because these questions, again, I can talk for hours about them, but we, the Sudanese people, are enabling foreign intervention. We have done that. We have done this since our independence. We have allowed the Egyptians, which were the most intervening in Sudan since its independence, and British, Americans, and all the elites. And the elites, by the elites, I mean the political parties, the leaders, the military leaders, the business people, businessmen mainly. And throughout the last 70 years, new actors came into the picture, the play. UAE, Saudi Arabia had taken a big chunk of this. So we are enabling the forces like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar to have such a damaging impact on or influence in Sudan. This said, it doesn't mean that we should accept this as it's only our fault. This is our fault, and we should be accountable for it. But we should also make these countries accountable for what they are doing, because they are not doing these things against us in Sudan only. The UAE is doing it for others. And one main thing now is you know how the relationship with the UAE, as we speak now, the Sudanese political forces are afraid of saying publicly the role the UAE is doing. We actually have major political figures who are residing in the UAE, affiliated with UAE. Someone earlier, I think Anwar, mentioned Dr. Ibtisam al-Kitbi. She was, I didn't study political science, but she was a professor in my university. So yeah, until we get our act together, I think we should address these issues from what our elites, our political forces are doing. We should do more in exposing what the UAE and other foreign players are doing, supporting both factions. In my view, my personal view, and all what I said, I can provide evidences to. I cannot provide an evidence to the fact that my personal belief is the UAE is, the army, the SAF leadership is still keeping the connections with the UAE. The UAE has supported the four military members of the Sovereign Council. They supported them throughout what was supposed to be the Rabi'a of Sudan, the massacre of the sit-in in June 3rd, 2019. And my belief is that this is one of the explanations of why the armed forces had performed the way it had performed since this war started. In my view, it's Al-Burhan is afraid of a coup d'etat from the lower ranking officers. If it wasn't for this, probably he would have reached some sort of a deal with the UAE and with the RSF early on this war. And actually, yeah, this is one reason why they are continuing. And I agree with Dr. Suleiman, actually. All right. Yeah. So the last point is what my personal view about the UAE's role in peace negotiations. I think this war, it's about the time frame. I don't think that that the war or stability or peace in Sudan will be achieved in the next 1, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. I think it will take decades. So we have to know this and we have to work for it. But we also have to work on the shorter time frame of seizing these military operations now, because, and for this, the UAE has to be there, my view. We should, it should be there, whether we as Sudanese talk to it or not, talk to the UAE or not, I don't know. But I think this is the international community's role. The international community knows very well what the UAE is doing. They should at least live up to this. One thing I want to say, that Tom Perriello, the US Special Envoy, hasn't visited the UAE since his appointment. He made no less than 5 visits to the region, not the UAE. And I frankly, with all what the US representatives, the congressmen and women and senators are knowing, and what the intelligence reports they have about what the UAE is doing, and the same is true for the UK parliament members and government officials, the fact that they are not addressing this publicly is really worrying. 1 or 2 times, but the
before the UN, but the UAE actually, pushed back hard, and so, it's not that anything could be more.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
All right.
And thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any final thoughts, Laura and Tim?
I just wanted to respond to one of Chris's points about African Americans and how it's important that certain people are in certain roles. That only goes so far, and I'll say that because for the last 12 months, we have watched the UN ambassador, the US ambassador to the United Nations, veto one resolution after another to stop the genocide in Gaza. We have watched that, and it's not enough to have people sitting, black faces in high places. It's just simply not enough, because at the end of the day, they represent the United States. They do not represent the colonized or the decolonizing people of the global South. Sure, they identify in some ways, but I think we have to be very careful in thinking that they're natural allies just because they share the same skin color.
Thank you. Tim, any final thought? All right, let's put it together for our panelists. Thank you so much. We're going to transition to the next segment of the program, which is an open forum. But before we do that, I just want to take a moment to show appreciation to all of those who have made this symposium possible today. First is the African Studies Center team. Marwa Hassan worked very hard to make this symposium possible. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today because there was an unforeseen circumstances that happened last night. So we're wishing her a quick recovery from that small accident that we didn't see coming. So please, let's give it up for Marwa Hassan. Teye Pam and Anna Main and Lode Dion, then Bill Bryan, all of them worked extremely hard to make it possible for all of us here. And of course, our tech team, they've been here not just today, but beginning from yesterday when they started getting all of those slides and putting them together. So we show appreciation to them as well. And of course, Nana and Nayab from the Wiser Diplomacy Center, they've been here all day. I think they just left a few minutes ago, but we also show appreciation to them as well. And of course, Ambassador Susan Page, she's not just the director of the Wiser Diplomacy Center, but also an important associate of the African Studies Center. And of course, Yusuf Hassan is new here, but it doesn't also look like a new person. He's been engaged with us the moment he stepped in at Michigan here. So thank you very much. And our moderators, Jeff Emberlin, Masi Mutumba, Kelly Askew, and Martin Murray, who had to leave to go teach a class. So please, let's put it together for all of them. And all of you, our panelists from outside and within the university, we really appreciate your patience with us, and we say a big thank you for coming to this symposium. And we hope that we're going to make a difference in the lives of ordinary folks in Sudan and not the elite. Thank you so much, everyone. All right. Thank you, guys. This is going to be an open forum, and we're going to try as much as possible to just moderate the conversation while thinking about what the next steps for us would be. And to also remember that this is not just a gathering of academics, but also we have in our midst practitioners, activists, as well as students. But we all are going to participate in charting the next step for our engagement with not just Sudan, but also the geopolitical arrangement that has been critical to how this war is being prosecuted in the Sudan. And so the way we're going to do it is maybe those that are on this side will make maybe a 1 minute statement about what they think the next steps should be, and then we'll take the conversation from there. And we're going to be open-minded as much as possible to accommodate everyone's views. All right, thank you. So I'm going to start from this side, then Yusuf.
Okay, I guess I always go first. Okay. Yeah, no, I don't. Yeah, I don't also have like any prepared notes. I think also it's important to recognize that there have been like many voices that have been, suppressed during, I guess, the recent development in Sudan, like even during the transitional period. And I think that something was came a lot, I guess, in the different talks and and presentations. Obviously, it's very clear that the conflict it's very complex as far as like geopolitics in the region, and and that always comes at the expense of grassroots movements and and groups who are actually doing real work on the ground that actually can make difference in the lives of ordinary Sudanese. So I think like I started with this point because I think one of the I guess one of the hopes for us behind the symposium today is to together brainstorm different ideas and avenues for how we can actually support civil society mobilization, right? Like at at a particular level. Like I don't have a particular vision for it. Obviously, this is a collective effort. And I think in the room here we have different experiences that perhaps maybe we can draw from, even like from South Sudan to to Sudan, to working with a resistance committee on the grounds, different civil society organizations. I think this is like I think right now this is one of the biggest challenges, like for I guess for people who are really fighting for like like effective solutions or solutions that can actually make difference in the lives of people in Sudan is how can we actually mobilize civil society in a really effective way. So I would like us to think a little bit about that, and I don't know what form that might actually take, but I think it's very critical for for any solutions and for any long term for any long term I guess vision for for a new Sudan. So that would be one of the first items. The other thing as well, I think, like we heard a lot of different presentations and talks and analysis, and I think it would be really helpful, I think, for all of us to think a little bit about what are some of the things that maybe some of the analysis is missing, or you felt that it's actually opened up some new ways of thinking about the conflict, and where we can actually take that kind of research moving forward, right? And I think that would be very important, not just because for us as academics and we're always thinking about research, but I think that could be a very empirical research that can actually illuminate a lot of the I guess the tensions, right, and the issues on the ground, because I think that's one of there's a lot of discourse, right, that's happening in social media and by different political figures, and even within the popular movements in the country. But I feel that there is a big gap in terms of empirical evidence and things like that. That's why I think some of the work that, for instance, Dr. Baldu is doing in terms of collecting that kind of data, I think it's very, very important. And I think we've seen from some of the presentations today, there is some real data that actually exists that can actually help our understanding in terms of the roots of the conflict. So I think that would be I guess my second point, and I don't want to take up all the time, so.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Khalid.
I think I may take just less than a minute, but because everything that Yusuf said, I want to reiterate. I first began working on Sudan, of course, all my life since I was born, but really formally in the 1990s at the Brookings Institution in Washington. And at that time, the landscape looked completely different. There was a Sudan mafia, some you may know of, you know what I'm talking about, and some really were, let's say, in control of the narrative about Sudan and its policies. I think you know who I'm talking about. But I had the privilege of always being a spokesperson, so to speak, from the 1990s and onwards. I had the privilege of being mentored by Francis Deng from South Sudan, so my first real work was on South Sudan, not on Sudan. I don't like to call it South Sudan, that's my preference, but we can talk about that. I'm saying that because I think that when Yusuf and I we started talking about having a forum like this, there were two kind of objectives. One of them is to make sure it was participatory, that no one would have control over the narrative, something that, I've already had my 15 minutes of fame, I'm grateful to them, and now it's time to really open it up to have true participation. And that's important for those who are scholars of Sudan, and particularly for Sudanese in America who now represent a very different diaspora than in past years. Of course, the final and most important reason is that there's no other choice. The war is so devastating that we have to really come together and be honest about our different views. And the concept that revolved around all of that, for us and for me, of course, political scientists maybe, is the notion of civil society. It's an overused term. It's been refined in a myriad of ways for all of the right reasons. But why it's important is that it's a kind of a nice catchphrase or concept that we can all kind of begin our discussion and narrative about, mostly because the narrative in real life, militarily, economically, as we've heard today, has always been monopolized by militarism in Sudan. And the voices that we've tried to represent here, many of us, of course, are the voices of the Sudanese people. And that is one thing that we can do. And we know democracy and democratization cannot really occur without a stronger civil society. We have actually, this is a counterintuitive, contradictory things to say, but Sudan has had and still does probably one of the strongest civil societies in the African continent. I know that sounds strange, but it's one of the reasons for the brutality of the war. The resistance is so strong. So what we wanted to do is really talk about how civil society is really important in terms of resistance and transition to democracy, because that is still the objective. And what Dr. Mani said also, and learning from others. I'm always asked at this stage and age if there's any hope, and I say, well, I teach African politics, and I always teach Rwanda. I met Kagame when I was at Brookings, and he told me the war was coming. I met him again. He said, I told you so. Wars end. And there's a whole literature on that. You can Google it. You know, wars are devastating, but they end. And I think we were thinking that this should be really a moment where we make this a sustainable kind of deliberations. This would be the first iteration of it, and then it would continue. But what is it looking forward? How do we want to think about it? What can we learn from the experience of Liberia and Sierra Leone and Rwanda? I've been privileged to have students from all of these countries, and they've taught me the importance of civil society in setting the agenda for transition, in monitoring ceasefires, in being responsible for the protection of civilians. We don't see their intervention, inclusion in much of the narrative. And I would say the same about South Sudan, because I began writing about South Sudan before Sudan, basically, and we know that their same problems are there. We can talk about all the complications, but the fight and the struggle and the undermining of civil society in South Sudan is really at the very crux of the debacle in South Sudan, because people, probably you don't know, and now you know, South Sudan has a very strong, vibrant civil society that's tried very hard to actually get rid of people like Kier and others. So what we wanted to do is keep it open. I thought I was going to talk about half a minute, and I can't stop talking. Too much coffee today. But all right. After dominating the conversation, I thought maybe what we want to do is have people tell us what they got out of this, what is problematic, what is positive, and also most importantly, what do you think we need, all of us as a collective need to explore in the future? I'm going to stop there.
All right.
So I feel a little bit like a fraud as a non-Sudanese or South Sudanese up here. For me, I think I would like to see us maintain contacts and these connections. This has been really enlightening. Some of you I have heard of and long followed. Some of you I knew a long time ago and have not been in touch. But especially along the lines of civil society, I know some of the questions that I get asked a lot is, well, how can we help? What organizations would you recommend to support? So just now, I have several because they've been mentioned. But if we could even compile a list that's something that can be easily handed out, just like we've got all these QR codes, but a list that, you know, maybe doing different things. This one is medical, this one is, cooperative, this one is, I don't know. So that's one. I think the other thing is I'm always honored when I get asked to speak to the media, especially about Sudan, because it is not covered very often. And I would encourage everyone, you all have voices, you are from the country or the countries, you should really use those voices, make connections, and if you don't have them, your institutions definitely have connections with media, and they're especially to the Arabic media. I think that's a population that is not always well served, and they are also hungering for the news and analysis from different people from different parts of, whether it's the diaspora or other voices, so that it's not the same old, I don't want to be disparaging, but you know what I mean.
We got it.
Yes, thank you. I guess the last thing I would say is the organizations, not just who individuals could support or organizations could support, but who are some of the ones on the ground that that we could also be getting information from them about what their needs are, not just sort of, oh, support us or financial needs, but how can we help to elevate their names, their work? Because, I mean, these resistance committees, they have done the bulk of the hard work, getting stuff everywhere, even with the media blackout, the cell phone blackouts, everything, and they have just worked miracles. And then the last thing I would say is, we know that there are Sudanese organizations that are doing the conflict plotting and monitoring of where troops are, where the actions are. I think that's one of the things that's important. I'm not a scholar, so I don't, look at things in that way, but I think that's really important to find out what's really happening on the ground. And then those of you who have all this deep-seated knowledge about these connections and who's involved and where all of these different spokes are, would be really important. So I hope that we can kind of get at least some connections and contacts through that, and that would be at least one step.
All right, thank you. I have two ideas that I'm just going to throw out there and let us have a conversation about them. I'm not from the Sudan. I'm not a Sudanese expert, but I consider myself a Pan-Africanist. And one of the ideas that I have that we could have a conversation about is what I call archiving atrocities for accountability. And what I mean by this is thinking about what is going on in the Sudan makes me think about other atrocities that have been committed elsewhere in places like Guatemala and other Latin American countries during the era of military rule. But there were no social media platforms during that time. But in recent times, a lot of anthropologists have been working on forensics to identify bodies that were buried in unmarked graves, and thinking about how to use those bodies that can be counted to make those who committed those atrocities account for the deed they did against the people of these countries. And I think social media presents us with an opportunity to engage in this archiving process, because just like Ambassador Page mentioned earlier on, if you are able to mark where these troops are, then can we begin to archive all of the atrocities that they are committing, so that in future, when peace comes to Sudan, then we can now hold all of those military leaders accountable for their actions. Then the second point that I want to throw out there is about the role of the diaspora. And here, I'm not just thinking about the Sudanese diaspora, but I'm also thinking about the African diaspora and the Black diaspora across the world. How do we get them to engage in a form of advocacy for Sudan in ways that maybe can build on what civil society organizations in the Sudan are currently doing, and also civil society organizations that are outside of the Sudan are currently doing. So how do we bring all of these folks together to begin to advocate for the way forward for Sudan? So at this point, I think we can begin to take comments from everyone. So we've got two microphones on both sides of the hall. If you have maybe comments or questions.
Thank you all. So two things that I guess I'm thinking about in terms of like future conversations or just future topics. One is Well, Malade, I love what you said in terms of like the accountability piece, because I know in places like South Sudan, Rwanda, and South Africa, this idea of like truth and reconciliation commissions, right? Not that are always punitive, but just a sense of we can't move forward unless we collectively agree upon, you know, what happened, right? But then two, I'm wondering about the role of religious actors and institutions in peacemaking in Sudan, because just to the south in South Sudan, the church played a huge role in achieving peace, right? The World Council of Churches with the 1972 Addis Ababa Agreement, as well as kind of, you know, Dinka Nuer, you know, peace talks in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So that's just to say, I know that Sudan, demographically speaking, is very different. Nevertheless, I'm just wondering what types of productive conversations might be had about the role of either Sudanese specifically or multinational Islamic institutions, given the fact that the country is overwhelmingly Muslim.
Comments? Nisrin?
Some comment, I guess. So I think maybe one of the things that I've seen, certainly on social media, is this proliferation of like misinformation, propaganda, and you know, I think on the ground in Sudan, the youth, the young people had a very astute and nuanced analysis of what is happening, certainly the resistance committees, but I find in the diaspora, it depends, right? And there is, I think, part of what is happening is that we're seeing divisions in the diaspora that are preventing us from really having a more, like Dr. Beny was saying, like a more coordinated vision and sort of, yeah, like plan on what we're going to be doing. And you know, to some degree, I think I am a sort of, I'm not an interventionist. I think the solutions need to come from the ground. And so my second point would be, I would like to see something like this happen that maybe over Zoom, like the next iteration of this, highlight civil society people who are on the ground and in the region, right? So there's lots of people who are in Cairo, lots of people in Kampala, Nairobi, who are part of the resistance committees, who have, I think, very important analyses and who can guide maybe what the role in a diaspora could and should be. Yeah, and I just generally think that in the diaspora, I don't think we've done a very good job of coordinating our efforts, I think everybody's kind of doing their own thing. And some of it, I think, has to do with the fact that maybe many people aren't necessarily coming from organizing backgrounds. And I think if you are coming from an organizing background, then coalition building and sort of coordination becomes vital, right? And so in that, I also think, going back to the conversation earlier around, you know, Gaza versus Sudan, and then also the Congo, I do think that there are opportunities to connect with organizations that are already doing some of this work. There are lots of, you know, there's, for example, African Communities Together, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. They're already doing work to center Sudan in their organizing around immigration policy. We have yet to see a refugee visa being issued for any, you know, from any country, right? Given that this is the largest displacement crisis in the world, this is mind-boggling to me. And I think some of it has to do with us not maybe putting our weight behind already existing efforts within the migrant rights sort of organizing, right? So there's that. And then also in terms of the Congo and even Palestine, I mean, I've been working a little bit with the Friends of the Congo, having a conversation around, is there a possibility of starting some type of boycott, divestment campaign that goes across Sudan and the Congo? Of course, the Congo, it's complicated because every company is kind of somehow implicated. But there are, I think, ways that we could maybe identify companies that are having a particularly harmful role in all of these places, because some of them do, including, you know, companies that are in the UAE and so forth. So I think, and that could allow the student movement that is mobilized around Palestine to perhaps broaden its scope a little bit to include a divestment from the military-industrial complex, right? And then through that, you could have some education. Anyway, I know there's like a lot of disjointed thoughts, but these are some of my thoughts.
All right, thank you. I think there's one hand at the back there.
Thank you. Dr. Saeed again. Actually, we have a few of the Sudanese organizations whom are working now with the people of Sudan in helping them just to get food, transportation. I mean, day-to-day things which we are working with. I mean, just having some people now from a place called Rufa'a to get them to Shandi, we need about $200 per person because they have to work within areas where there is RSF and there is SAF. So they have to pay money for those to get people whom are sick, to get people whom are hungry. We have something called takiya. Takiya is a place or it's a kitchen where they will have food for people because there is no access to food. And we are trying to combat famine and hunger and shortage of food. So those are real needs which we cannot talk too much about, but we need to help on those ones. So I think we have to prioritize the work that we need to do in Sudan, things which has to do with immediate kind of need of the people right now versus the things which we need to do in the long run. One of the things which, and I think Dr. Baldo knows about, that we are trying to get something, American Sudanese Committee, in which we are gonna organize all the diaspora kind of organization so that they will work together, because when we have a small organization work, independent of each other, is very difficult, to get the help that you need. So one of the things we are trying to do is information center, which is gonna be an open source that people, will get those information. It will follow the people, on those places to see what's the population, the movement of the population, what kind of diseases that they have there. We work with SAPA, Sudanese American Physician Association, and we represent UCANA, University of Khartoum alumni, and we have some and other organizations, Sadagat, and all of them, they're doing, real work that needed right now. So I think sometimes the discussion goes about the political issues, about the other issues which are gonna wait. For the time being, we need to make sure that people are eating, drinking, having transportation, getting some of that money so that we could combat cholera, which is becoming now killing more people than bullets are killing them now. So if we are gonna go with this, I think we need to have that American Sudanese Committee to become a strong organization and to have a center of information that will be an open source, and that to, now we need to get the money, however it is, because we send it with different means which we cannot send it through the banking system, which is current, because nobody will send money to Sudan. But the people and the resistance committees are the one whom we send that money to, and it is very dangerous. How they get the, sometimes the pharmaceuticals, because they have to smuggle it to areas, and if they get caught, they get killed. So it is real problem which is going on. So we would like to talk to you guys about how we could resolve those issues and how we could help the people of Sudan at this time. Thank you.
All right, thank you. There is someone, I know.
I totally support the idea of archiving for accountability, but this is coming from a disappointed spirit. Don't take it too seriously. So, we've had a lot of criminal, right, in the International Criminal Court accountable. We know they've committed terrible atrocities and everything, not just in Sudan, in different countries. So, and they, nothing happened to them. And so, I don't know. Okay, we know who committed those, Like, for example, the RSF, well, before it becomes the RSF, the Janjaweed, they committed terrible atrocity in 2004, genocide, and yet the European Union dealt with them and handed them funds, right, and probably weapons also. So I don't know. It's an amazing quest, but just tell me something opposite to what I believe now.
I think Amani behind you. Other hands up. Oh, okay. Yes.
So thank you so much. I would like to see in the next symposium or event a track or a panel that discusses the peacemaking and reflecting on the many peacemaking processes that we had in the past in Sudan. So we had the Mashakos Nevasha that ended with the CPA, South Sudan. We had the 2019 the transitional government. We had the framework agreement. So and we're seeing the results. So we want reflections on this because it seems that at the onset of this war, there was some serious debate here in the US and in the West about how we failed failed the Sudanese people by insisting on that peacemaking model. But 5 or 6 months later, that the voices that debated that or started criticizing that model kind of went to the background, and we had now a rebirth for almost the same thing, or people saying all what is needed is bring these people to the negotiating table. To do what? No one is answering this. So we say that we failed because there was no accountability before in the previous peace processes. And no one is saying, so they are like, this was one of the framework agreement discussions that, well, we'll have transitional justice. But what does transitional justice mean to the leaders of SAF and RSF who are who are on the table, who will not sign to something that will make them accountable? So yeah, I would like to see like a dedicated thing to this, a dedicated.
I'd just like to add one word to this conversation, which is education. I mean, this is a serious problem, and it's going to make, you know, the more years that students are not in school, the more difficult it will be to rebuild Sudan. And I don't know comprehensively around the country, obviously in hot conflict zone schools not happening, but I also know that in the north where I work, schools have been closed for most of the last 2 years, and you know, so that starts to we bemoan that for the pandemic losses in the education in America, but it's nothing like what's going on in Sudan. So anyway, just wanted to add that thought to the conversation.
Thank you.
Hi, so I'm a student. I'm not Sudanese. I'm of Liberian background, but I have been chit-chatting with my Sudanese girls, in our group chat the whole time today. And as a student, no shade to the professors in the room, love you guys, but I feel like one thing that is always kind of missing sometimes when we kind of have these discussions at the end of like, okay, what do we do and how do we kind of spread the message? I think one thing I've learned from my professors, but just my own education, is that, and as a PhD student in information science, so like talk about information spreading, like I understand the tool it can be, especially with how people perceive the internet as a way of disseminating that. But I think 2 questions to ask or to think about proceeding forward in whatever way is like, what questions are we actually trying to engage in and with, and also like the methodologies to do that, because I think education is important, but I would say literacy. I feel like there's low literacy, both like the diaspora, but also just like how to communicate that to other African communities, because I've seen how war within my own background really has ripple effects that like can't even be explained or captured in media. So I feel like that's two things that often I feel like is kind of left in the conversation sometimes, is to really think about the methodologies, because I feel like in this room you have a lot of expertise, you have a lot of knowledge, but how do you communicate that past the people in this room, past the academy, past whatever? And I mean, we all have stakeholders, right? You all have people that you can connect with outside of the academy to spread these information. So I feel like for me, as a student, I would push back to the higher-ups in the room. Okay, don't come at me. I'm just saying, like, use your network, use the people you're connected to actually push this information, so we're not just always talking amongst ourselves.
If I can, sorry, I know time. I would like to just add, I know education was one word that was just added, trauma. I know the 2 decades now of like the whole population is going to be living in the shadow of trauma. So I don't know how we're going to be able to address that, but I think it has to be part of the conversation as well.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take one more comment and try to wrap up. All right, thank you, everyone. So closing remarks from all of you, if there is any.
Yeah, I guess I don't really have a lot. I think I just want to thank you all. I think it's been really generative. Yeah, I think we captured like a lot of different ideas, and I think obviously, you know, after a gathering like this today, it's usually like what I usually call it like an intellectual feast in a way, so you kind of need to digest. So I think definitely we need to continue this conversation, and I guess we'll figure out ways to at least stay engaged and keep the conversation going, and I'm hoping that a few more concrete ideas or more actionable ideas, I think, will kind of emerge out of that. And I think, you know, there are a few ideas for probably perhaps maybe not future conferences, but even just like, you know, talks or panels. I think this group can probably convene and, you know, and invite others. So thank you so much for your generosity with your ideas and, you know, and all of that. So
I'm having Professor Dr. Madani go last because he was the keynote speaker.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yes.
And I'm really just going to say thank you so much for including me in this, and it's been a real honor to be with you all. And I just appreciate learning and hearing from everyone and hoping that I can be useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I should thank the organizers and all our friends. Thank you. Can I call you Susan? Or
of course you can.
Ambassador Page?
No,
Susan's
you can
okay,
even call
yes.
me Susie, as I said.
Susie, even better.
Yeah.
Even better. So this has just been a great honor to me. It is a true story that I asked Yusuf if I could be invited to give the keynote. It's a country that's given a lot to my family personally and my community in Sudan. And it's a country where, as Dr. Amani said, it's also a personal issue. I feel the same way about my other communities in the United States, by the way, but we can talk about that in another event. So I wanted to thank everyone and the African Studies Center in particular. There are a couple of things I wanted to just point out about the items in the future. I think I want to reiterate that it's important to learn from the other countries. So when we're talking about bringing people to talk about peace agreements, I would, also, bring in maybe the idea of bringing someone who's an expert and from Liberia or Sierra Leone and others. And I think that that's important. On security sector reform, I think it's never too early to talk about the mistakes. The issue of peace agreements, as you know, now there's a consensus, unfortunately, that they lead to war rather than resolve conflict. So we need to discuss if peace agreements of the type that have been implemented in the past in Sudan are even what we want or what people think will bring peace. And the issue of security sector reform, the literature on that is really vast. Most of it is very critical. It's based on just giving these fighters some money and, you know, cash advances and everything will be okay. And now we know that we have to take, you know, psychological, cultural, you know, local issues into account to fully think about how to integrate these militias that Nisreen explained so well. Part of the reason is displacement, and from displacement comes, of course, issues of psychology and social alienation, and that's what the literature tells us. So those are the kind of panels I think maybe we can think about in the future. On the issue of education, that's another reason to talk about it, because many of us are working with scholars at risk, for example, to help at least some few. That's obviously a very minor thing, but the concern among Sudanese, whether it's here or Egypt or Uganda, on the issue of education is central, but we haven't come together to coordinate a real response. So we thank you for that. And finally, the student who was rude enough to criticize professors.
I can give you her full name.
Oh, yes. Yes, I'm going to dox her. No, I'm not going to use that word.
And she's in Laura's class as
Is that
well.
right?
So there are a few of us here.
I know Laura very well, actually, so I can give you some inside information. But I wanted to just say that when I mentioned participatory, I meant methodology. And I meant, and you said it much better than we professors can say it, obviously. But the whole idea is to have something different from the kind of forums in which experts and professors come, but to have it fully participatory, and that includes methodology in terms of, and here as an example is getting input from the diaspora that may not be interested even in the academy, and most are not, but they're interested in their people. And so this is why it's really important to have that cross-fertilization. And so your assignment is to come up with a methodology for us, and then we can use it. And it's not going to be paid, non-paid assignment. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure for all of us, so we appreciate it.
All right, thank you, everyone. So if you have any receipt, our outside guest, please give the receipt to Lode, or you can also email it to her or to Marwa, and she's going to have the final say.
Hi, everyone. Just a quick announcement for those that will be going to the dinner tonight. If you'd like to go home or back to your hotel to rest emotionally, intellectually, physically, feel free to do so. The dinner will be at 6 o'clock at Grizzly Peak, but someone will meet our external panelists at the hotel at around 5:40, 5:45 to walk over. So thank you all so much for coming and for such a wonderful symposium. So thank you.
Should we take a picture?
Yes.
For us, I guess, like the panel.